Hello everybody and welcome back for more Flute Tube. Today we're going to talk about articulation, and we have already discussed several articulation topics. We've talked about single tonguing, double tonguing, spitting rice to learn more about your articulation and what exactly you want to do with your tongue, how your tongue is very flexible like an octopus, and in fact next episode we're going to talk about triple tonguing. But today there's a certain kind of articulation that I'm going to talk to you about that I'm kind of scared actually to talk about. It's kind of like the episode where I talked about practicing in front of the TV and how that can be a really good thing to do if you don't overdo it, if you don't do it too much. And this kind of articulation is like that. It's a great tool to have to use carefully and sparingly, but you don't want to overdo it. There will be times, if you give yourself this tool, that this is your best way to make a really great, reliable, clear, clean articulation. It is finger articulation. What is finger articulation and why would you use it? In its most basic meaning, articulation refers to how you start and stop a note. How do you begin a note? How does it end? What is the overall shape of the note, the shape of its attack and decay? We as flutists most often think about articulation meaning the beginning of the note, because that's where usually our tongue gets involved, shaping the articulation of the note. But it really does refer to the whole note. If you think about staccatos, for instance, of course the articulation is not only going to refer to how the note starts, but also how the note decays at the end in order to make it be a shorter staccato note. Finger articulation refers to how your fingers close the keys when you play and also how they lift back up. When it boils right down to it, we are always using finger articulation. Everything we do is articulated not only with our air and our tongues, but also with our fingers. If our fingers are uncoordinated, we might get sloppy finger articulation. We want our fingers to be completely coordinated and not cause any distractions from our playing. That means that our finger articulation nearly all the time should be very subdued, smooth, gentle, unobtrusive, so that we don't get the impression that the flute tone is created by pushing down buttons or keys. We want to give the audience the impression that it's completely natural and spontaneous, like it is when we sing. Once in a rare while, we get an instruction from a composer to kind of slap a key in a percussive way, and that's the only time that we should ever slap keys. There are times and places that a composer asks for this kind of thing. But aside from those rare times and places, remember that you are never allowed to slap your fingers down on your keys. Because there are times when we're going to use a finger articulation in a very specific meaning. It involves putting your finger down on the key precisely, with precision, with rhythm, but it's never going to be a slap. Aside from the idea that I've mentioned that we are always articulating with our fingers, there's a very specific place where I call something a finger articulation. And that's when you do an articulation with your fingers, but not with your tongue. The question here is, when would you decide to use this finger articulation with no tongue articulation? It often has to do with getting the low register to speak. For instance, you might have an entrance on a low D, and it's hard to get that D to speak exactly when you want it to, with exactly the tone that you want. In these cases, if you leave your tongue out and you move a finger in order to get that air to sound, that's what I refer to as a finger articulation. This kind of place is rare. It's usually in the low register. For instance, if you have an entrance on a low D or C or even a low B, I'll give you some examples of places like this in music. I'll play some for you. One is the Mendelssohn Midsummer Night's Dream, big important flute excerpt that starts on a low D. You need that D to speak exactly in rhythm. You need it to speak exactly on the last eighth note of the measure that it's written because it's the beginning of your big solo. It cannot be late. And you also don't want it to partially speak or crack or go up the octave. You want it to be so reliable. And it can be very difficult to coordinate your tongue with your airspeed and be entirely sure it's going to happen just the way you want it to happen. For those occasional places where you have an entrance on a low note and it needs to be entirely precise, you don't want it to come in late or be sluggish speaking, you can do a finger articulation and you can count on it every time. So if you have an entrance, for instance that low D of the Midsummer Night's Dream excerpt, you can do this. Instead of trying to coordinate your airspeed exactly with your tongue articulation, you leave your tongue out of the equation altogether. You finger that low D, and then you're going to choose a finger to lift and put down. A lot of people choose your left hand third finger. I'm a little worried the reason they choose it is it's kind of fun and easy to slap it. So again, if you choose that finger, you're going to place it down. You're never going to slap it, but you can choose a different finger. You could choose your right hand first finger. You could choose the finger that's the lowest one down to close the lowest hole for the D. So I might choose one of those three fingers, but it really doesn't matter. You're just going to finger your low D, pick up a finger of your choice, get your air in your lungs, then just leave your tongue hanging out at the bottom of your mouth, out of the way of the airstream. You start to blow with your air exactly when you place your finger down to get your D to speak. Sometimes I pick the last finger that's used in whatever the note is that I'm about to play. For instance, if I'm going to play a low D, I might pick my right hand third finger for the psychological reason that I know when I play a low note, the air needs to vibrate all the way down my flute tube to that last closed tone hole. I like to think of sending the airstream down past that last key that I'm closing. As far as our rule about not slapping the keys, keep this in mind. We're constantly lifting and placing fingers. Everything we do, every note we play nearly, we're lifting and placing down fingers. So if you think about finger articulations within that normal context of you're just going to lift a finger and place a finger down like you do all the time, there's nothing wrong with doing finger articulations. As soon as you start to feel tempted to slap and push down extra hard in order to get that to articulate, then it's a problem and it's wrong. I remember when I was in high school and I was introduced to this Midsummer Night's Dream excerpt, that D that begins the whole solo was a bit of a gamble. Hopefully it would come out right. It would come out in the right place. It would speak well. It wouldn't crack. Chances were really good it would work, but there was a bit of a chance that it would not work. Then, when I went to Oberlin Conservatory and I studied with Michel Debost and we worked on this excerpt, he told me to use a finger articulation. It's not cheating, we can do it. Once I studied this excerpt with Michel Debost and he told me to use a finger articulation, it stopped being a gamble. I know what I'm going to do with my finger and my airstream. My tongue is just out of the equation. I know when I play this excerpt, I will always get the entrance. Almost always when I decide to use a finger articulation, it's because I have an entrance that needs to be precisely rhythmic and the phrase is starting on one of my very lowest notes. But there are other places, depending on context, once in a while where I will use more than one finger articulation. And there are even some contexts where I might articulate with a couple of fingers rather than just one finger. I might have repeated low notes beyond the one that begins the phrase and feel that a few more finger articulations help me to get those lowest notes to speak. I do use these sparingly. What I'm showing you are exceptions rather than a rule. But even though I may not use any finger articulations in the course of a few weeks of playing my flute, depending on what I'm working on, this is a very valuable tool to add to your kit of flute tools. And if you appreciate the information, if you feel like it will be useful to you or your students or your friends, please give this video a like and come back for next week's episode on triple tonguing. We'll talk about not only what it is, but a lot of ideas to help make it better depending on the context.